All right, today we're tackling a pretty provocative argument that's been making the rounds online. It's all about a bold, and I mean bold, rewriting of the Spanish conquest of the Americas. So let's just get right into it.
So, the source material doesn't waste any time. It comes right out of the gate with this statement, basically throwing down the gauntlet and challenging everything you've probably heard. The argument is, essentially, that the Spanish didn't find some paradise. They found, and I'm quoting here, a slaughterhouse, and they were actually right to shut it down. Okay, so our job here, together, is to really unpack this argument. We're going to look at it piece by piece, exactly as it's laid out in the source video. We'll dig into the historical claims they make, the evidence they point to, and how they connect all of that to a message for today.
All right, Section 1. Challenging the narrative. The stolen land problem. The argument kicks right off by going after the whole stolen land idea, and its position is pretty straightforward. Look, you can't understand this conquest in a vacuum. You first have to understand what conquest is, and how it's been a part of, well, all of human history.
The video's whole point here is that conquest wasn't some special thing that only Europeans did. It points to examples right from the Americas, the Aztecs, the Inca, the Comanche, and argues that many of the peoples we think of as native were in fact conquerors themselves. The big idea they're pushing is that history isn't just one bad event. It's this constant story of one group conquering another.
So if conquest is just what happens, right? If it's universal, then the video poses this really critical question. It basically says, okay, if one group is going to replace another anyway, then the real question isn't that it happened, but what replaced what? Was the thing that came after better or worse than what was there before? And boom, that question right there is the foundation for their entire argument.
Okay, Section 2, The Horrors of Aztec Rule. Subtitle, The Slaughterhouse Civilization. So now we get into the real core of the video's case against the Aztec Empire. And this is where it lays out its most graphic and frankly shocking evidence to back up its central claim, that the Spanish didn't just conquer a civilization, they shut down what the source calls a demonic evil.
That first thing the video hits you with is just the sheer scale of it all. It points to this archaeological find from 2015, the Huitzilopochtli. It's this massive rack of skulls discovered in the Aztec capital. And the number the source puts on it is 130,000 human skulls. And it makes a point to say that includes men, women, and even children.
And to really hammer home the intensity of all this, the source brings up another just staggering figure. It claims that for one single ceremony, just 4 days, to reconsecrate the Great Pyramid, something like 20,000 people were sacrificed. The video even adds this chilling detail that the priests had to work in shifts because their arms were literally getting too tired.
But it's not just about the huge numbers. The video then goes into the specifics of the rituals themselves. It describes, for instance, how children would be sacrificed to a rain god, and that their tears were considered important. So if they stopped crying, the source says, priests would tear off their fingernails to make them start again. It also talks about priests wearing the flayed skin of victims as, part of their religious ceremonies.
All right, Section 3, An Army of Allies. Subtitle, Reframing the Conquest. So, after painting this incredibly dark picture of the Aztec Empire, the video then pivots to how it all came crashing down. And this is where it really tries to flip the script on the story we all know. That classic image of a few hundred Spaniards taking down a massive empire all by themselves.
Yeah, this comparison really gets to the heart of it. On one side, you've got the story we usually hear, 500 Spaniards versus this huge Aztec empire. But the source video paints a totally different picture. It argues that it was actually 500 Spaniards plus an army of 200,000 indigenous allies who were sick of Aztec rule and wanted them gone.
And the video is very clear on this point. These allies weren't confused or tricked. It names specific groups, like the Tlaxcalans, and claims they had been suffering under the Aztecs for years, constantly being raided for people to sacrifice. So the argument goes, these groups made a conscious choice. They saw the Spanish arrive and viewed it as their chance for a war of liberation.
All right, Section 4, Inventing the Noble Savage. Subtitle, The Root of the Lie. So, you might be asking yourself, if all this is true, according to the source, why is the story we learn in school so different? Well, this next section is all about the video's explanation for what it calls the lie.
The video traces the origin of this quote-unquote lie back to the 18th century. And this philosophical idea called the noble savage. It pins this on the philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau, claiming he's the one who pushed this idea that early humans were all peaceful and pure.
and that it was civilization, especially the church, that corrupted them. And here's where it gets political. The source claims this noble savage idea was never about history. It was, in their words, propaganda. Propaganda specifically designed, it argues, to make people hate their own heritage so that they wouldn't stand up and defend it. It was a tool to undermine the church and Western civilization itself.
So this timeline kind of lays out the whole story according to the video. It goes like this. In 1519, at the time of the Conquest, everyone knew how brutal the Aztecs were. Then, a couple hundred years later, Rousseau invents this noble savage myth for political reasons. And now, today, that myth is what's being taught in our textbooks as if it were actual history.
All right, Section 5, A Modern Call to Action. Subtitle, From Historical Argument to Modern Mandate. So this whole thing isn't just a history lesson for the video's creators. In this final part, it takes this entire historical argument and connects it directly to what it sees as an urgent message for right now, for today. The source really lays it on thick here, making the case that Christianity is the absolute bedrock of Western civilization. It claims the faith is responsible for, hospitals, universities, the very idea of human dignity. It even makes the pretty interesting argument that it was Christianity that gave people the moral tools to even question the idea of conquest in the first place. And this is the final piece of the puzzle. The video argues that if you teach people that their history, their heritage, is just this shameful, evil story, well, they're not going to want to defend their civilization. It frames the whole thing as a kind of spiritual battle happening right now.
And it all builds to this final call to action, and it is not subtle. It's basically telling its audience, stop apologizing. Stand up for a faith that, in its view, created cultures that were superior to the pagan systems that came before. It reframes the Spanish conquest not as something to be ashamed of, but as a morally righteous act.
And so the source video leaves its audience with this one final powerful scenario. It puts you on the beach with Cortés back in 1519, and it gives you a choice. Do you respect their culture, or do you put the priests to the sword? It forces you to ask, when you're faced with something like that, what is the truly moral thing to do?